What would you do if you woke up to find that every building in your town was burning at exactly the same moment? Not from accident, not from nature, but from a deliberate hand that wanted your entire world erased from existence. Welcome to this journey into one of America's most chilling unsolved mysteries. But before we descend into the ashes of a town that vanished in a single night, I need you to ask yourself something. How many people would need to agree before an act of destruction becomes acceptable? Where is the line between vengeance and justice? Tell us where you're watching from right now, and whether you believe one person's rage could be powerful enough to obliterate an entire community. Because by the end of this account, you'll understand that sometimes the most terrifying fires are the ones we never saw coming. This episode discusses real historical events involving property destruction, community trauma, and unexplained violence. The details included serve understanding, not sensationalism, but they involve disturbing elements of arson, conspiracy theories, and social injustice. Viewer discretion is advised. In the archives of Catitas County, Washington, there exists a collection of documents that shouldn't still haunt investigators over 130 years later, but they do. Among the photographs of charred timber and twisted metal, among the insurance claims and witness statements, there are references to something that was discovered the morning after the fire. Scattered across the blackened ruins like confetti at a funeral, bright red cards bearing a message written in careful ink. The words were simple, direct, and absolutely chilling. You have no pity. We show no mercy. No one ever discovered who wrote them. No one ever found the author. And to this day, no one knows who set the fire that destroyed Ellensburg, Washington, on the night of July the 4th, 1889. We're about to delve into a mystery that has consumed fire investigators, historians, and amateur detectives for more than a century. A mystery where the more you learn, the less certain you become. Where one town's ambition to become the capital of a new state may have transformed into a death sentence. Where rage, revenge, and ruthless calculation may have converged in a single devastating night. This isn't just a story about a fire. This is a question about how thin the line really is between civilization and chaos, between community and catastrophe. It was the year 1889. Benjamin Harrison had just been sworn in as America's 23rd president. The Eiffel Tower had opened to the public in Paris, a monument to human achievement soaring into the sky. But in the American West, in the soon-to-be state of Washington, achievement was being measured in railroad tracks and timber, in expansion and competition, in the race to build towns that would define the future, and in that race, sometimes the stakes became so high that winning and survival became the same thing. The summer of 1889 would prove to be unlike any other in Washington Territory's history. It would be remembered not for births, but for deaths, not for what was built, but for what burned. Seattle would burn in June, Spokane would burn in August. And between them, on the night celebrating America's independence, Ellensburg would burn with such intensity that witnesses 30 miles away would see the glow against the mountains and know that something catastrophic was happening. What those witnesses didn't know, what nobody knew until the sun rose on July the 5th, was that this fire had been different. This fire had started everywhere at once, and someone wanted to make sure the town knew exactly why. To understand what happened in Ellensburg, you first need to understand what Ellensburg was, and what it desperately wanted to become. Picture, if you will, a valley in central Washington Territory, carved between the Cascade Mountains to the west and the ancient, worn peaks of the Wenatchee Range to the east. The Yakima River cuts through this landscape like a silver thread, and in 1889, the valley was still wild in ways that are hard to imagine today. Sagebrush stretched across the high desert in every direction. The wind came down from the mountains carrying the scent of pine and snow, even in summer. At night, the darkness was absolute, the kind of darkness that makes you understand why humans first learned to fear the unknown. But Ellensburg was not afraid of the dark. Ellensburg was ambitious. The town had been founded only a decade earlier, in 1875, by John Shouty, who'd had the foresight to establish a trading post where the Yakima River could be forded. By 1886, the Northern Pacific Railroad had arrived, and with it came the promise that transforms frontier settlements into American cities, connection to the wider world. Suddenly, Ellensburg wasn't just another dusty outpost. It was a hub. It was opportunity. It was the future. By 1889, the town had swelled to nearly 4,000 residents, a remarkable number for such a remote location. Main Street bustled with activity. Victorian-era homes lined the residential streets, their gingerbread trim and painted facades announcing that this was a community with aspirations. The business district contained everything a thriving town needed: general stores, saloons, restaurants, hotels, a bank, churches, a newspaper office. The Knights of Pythias, a fraternal organization that prided itself on friendship, charity, and benevolence, had established a lodge and regularly hosted dances at the Johnson House Hotel, bringing the community together for evenings of music and socializing. Most importantly, Ellensburg had ambition that reached beyond commerce. Washington Territory was on the verge of statehood, scheduled to be admitted to the Union in November of 1889. And the question that consumed every major town in the territory was simple: which community would become the state capital? Olympia had been the territorial capital for 3 decades, but it was small, isolated, and by 1889, somewhat run down. Yakima was growing rapidly, but lacked the infrastructure for government. Seattle had size, but was considered too far west, too dominated by shipping interests. Spokane was too far east. Tacoma was too small. Ellensburg, however, Ellensburg was perfect. Central location. Railroad access, growing population, modern buildings, civic pride, community infrastructure. It had everything a state capital needed. And people in Ellensburg knew it. They spoke openly about their certainty that when the Constitutional Convention delegates gathered in Olympia on July 4, 1889, the very day the town would later burn, discussions would inevitably turn to where the permanent capital should be located, and Ellensburg was ready to make its case. But here's what you need to understand about ambition: it doesn't exist in a vacuum. For every town that rises, another fears it will fall. For every winner, there must be losers. And sometimes the fear of losing can transform ordinary people into something darker. The spring and early summer of 1889 had been unusually hot and dry across Washington Territory. By late June, the entire region was under dry, the kind of conditions that make fire departments nervous and insurance companies reach for higher premiums. Wooden buildings, and almost everything in Washington Territory was built of wood, became not shelters but kindling waiting for a spark. On June the 6th, 1 month before Ellensburg would burn, Seattle suffered what would be called the Great Seattle Fire. It started at 2:30 in the afternoon in a woodworking shop at the corner of Front Street and Madison Avenue, when a worker named John Back accidentally overturned a pot of boiling glue. He panicked and threw water on it, exactly the wrong response to a grease fire. The flames spread to sawdust on the floor, then to wooden walls, then to building after building as the wind picked up, and the inadequate water supply failed to contain the blaze. By the next morning, 29 blocks of Seattle's downtown had been consumed, 100 acres. Nearly every wooden structure in the business district. Miraculously, no one died, but thousands were left homeless, and the economic damage was catastrophic. The lesson seemed clear. In a wooden city during a dry summer, fire was not just possible, it was inevitable. And Washington Territory's towns took note. Ellensburg, watching Seattle burn from 200 miles away, made a decision. On July the 4th, the town would celebrate America's independence, but there would be no fireworks. The risk was too great. The summer was too dry. The buildings were too close together. They would gather, they would dance at the Knights of Pythias Hall. They would celebrate, but they would do it safely. Except someone else had different plans. July the 4th, 1889, began like any Independence Day in small, town America, with optimism, celebration, and the particular kind of joy that comes from having survived another year in a harsh landscape. In Olympia, 140 miles to the west, delegates to the Constitutional Convention gathered for the first time, beginning the process of drafting the document that would transform Washington Territory into Washington State. The weight of history hung over their deliberations. They were creating something permanent, something that would outlast all of them. And among the questions they would eventually need to address, where would the permanent capital be located? In Ellensburg, the day was warm and clear. The temperature climbed into the 80s hot for the mountains, but not unbearable. As evening approached, townspeople began gathering at the Johnson House Hotel for the Knights of Pythias dance. This was a social highlight, an evening where the community's leading citizens would come together, where relationships would be strengthened, where the bonds of friendship and civic pride would be reinforced. The Johnson House stood on Main Street, a substantial wooden structure that embodied Ellensburg's prosperity. Inside, oil lamps cast a warm glow across polished floors. Women wore their finest dresses. Men gathered to discuss business and politics. The band tuned their instruments. Children ran between adults' legs, too excited by the holiday to sit still. Outside, darkness fell across the valley like a curtain. By 9 o'clock, most of Ellensburg's residents were either at the dance or in their homes, preparing for bed. The streets were quiet. The shops were closed and locked. A few saloons remained open, their windows spilling yellow light onto the wooden sidewalks. The wind, which had been calm during the day, began to rise. A northeast wind coming down from the mountains, steady and insistent. Later, witnesses would remember this wind. They would remember how it seemed to arrive at exactly the wrong moment, as if the night itself had conspired against them. At approximately 10:15 in the evening, someone at the dance noticed something wrong. At first, it was just an unusual flickering visible through the windows, an orange glow that didn't belong to lamplight or stars. Then came the smell, smoke, sharp and acrid, carried on the strengthening wind. Then came the shouts. Fire, the word tore through the Johnson house like a physical force. The music stopped mid-note. Conversations died. For a single heartbeat, everyone froze, caught between disbelief and recognition. Then chaos erupted as the crowd surged toward the doors and windows to see what was burning. What they saw defied comprehension. It wasn't one building on fire. It was several. The glow wasn't coming from a single source. It was coming from multiple locations scattered across the downtown area, all burning simultaneously. J.S. Anthony's grocery store on Main Street between 4th and 5th Avenue was ablaze, flames already reaching through the roof. But so was another building 2 blocks away, and another beyond that, and another. The fire wasn't spreading from a single ignition point. It was erupting from multiple origins at once. In the first moments, the townspeople's response was heroic. Men ran toward the flames with buckets. Others rushed to alert the volunteer fire department. The fire bell began to ring, its iron voice cutting through the night with urgent authority. Within minutes, the volunteers were assembling their equipment: hoses, buckets, axes, hooks for pulling down burning structures to create fire breaks. But they were already too late. The wind that had begun as a steady breeze was now a gale, pushing from the northeast with relentless force. Every burning ember it caught was transformed into a projectile, launching across streets to ignite roofs and wooden sidewalks. The fire began to connect, separate blazes merging into a single advancing wall of flame that moved with terrible purpose through Ellensburg's wooden heart. Witnesses later struggled to describe what it was like to watch their town burn. Some spoke of the sound, not just the roar of flames, but the constant crack and crash of buildings collapsing, the explosion of windows shattering from heat, the groaning of timber as structural integrity failed. Others remembered the light, how the fire turned night into a hellish noon, casting shadows that danced and writhed like living things, illuminating faces with orange and red that made everyone look like demons or ghosts. But what haunted them most was the feeling of helplessness, of watching everything they'd built, everything they'd invested their lives and futures in, being consumed while they stood by with buckets that suddenly seemed obscenely inadequate, like trying to hold back an ocean with cupped hands. The volunteer fire department fought with desperate courage. They connected hoses to hydrants only to discover what Seattle had learned a month earlier: the water pressure was pathetically insufficient. When multiple hoses were deployed simultaneously, the pressure dropped to nothing. Water that should have shot in powerful arcs, capable of dousing flames, instead dribbled out in weak streams that evaporated before reaching the fire. Some firefighters tried to create fire breaks by tearing down buildings that hadn't yet caught, hoping to deny the fire fuel and stop its advance. But the wind was too strong, the embers too numerous, the fire too hot. For every building they demolished, 3 more ignited. As the hours passed, the reality became inescapable. Ellensburg was going to burn. The only question was how much would be left when it was over. Residents made agonizing decisions in seconds. What do you save when you can only carry what fits in your arms? Family photographs or financial records, heirlooms or clothes. Some people froze, paralyzed by choice. Others grabbed whatever was nearest and ran. Mothers carried children. Men dragged trunks. The elderly were helped or carried to safety beyond the fire's reach. And through it all, the fire advanced with a kind of intelligence, finding weak points, exploiting fuel, spreading with awful efficiency through a town built of wood and hope. By midnight, the heart of Ellensburg's business district was gone. 10 blocks of buildings reduced to burning timber and twisted metal. The heat was so intense that witnesses 30 miles away in North Yakima could see the glow against the night sky and knew, with sick certainty, that something terrible was happening. The fire burned until 3:30 in the morning, when it finally began to run out of fuel. The wind died down. The remaining buildings, often saved only by luck of location or desperate intervention, stood like lonely teeth in a mouth of ash. As dawn broke on July the 5th, 1889, the citizens of Ellensburg emerged from wherever they'd taken shelter to witness what remained of their town. The devastation was almost total. Approximately 200 homes destroyed, 10 complete city blocks in the business district erased. The economic loss was estimated at $2 million, roughly $450 million in today's money. But here's the detail that transforms this from tragedy into mystery. Scattered throughout the ruins, prominent citizens began finding something that didn't belong, something that suggested this fire had been anything but accidental. They were small rectangular cards, bright red in color, each one bearing the same message written in careful black ink. You have no pity, we show no mercy. And suddenly, every assumption about what had happened needed to be reconsidered. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't bad luck. Someone had done this. Someone with a grudge, with rage, with a message. Someone had deliberately set Ellensburg ablaze. But who and why? The morning after the fire brought a kind of shocked silence to Ellensburg. Smoke still rose from the ruins in lazy curls. The smell was overwhelming: burnt wood, melted metal, destroyed lives. People wandered through the debris, faces blank with disbelief, searching for anything salvageable from the wreckage of their homes and businesses. The red cards changed everything. According to newspaper accounts from the days following the fire, several reputable citizens reported finding these cards in their yards, among the ashes, pinned to surviving structures. The accounts don't specify exactly how many cards were found or who found them, but the message was clear enough to send ripples of fear through the traumatized community. You have no pity, we show no mercy. The phrasing was deliberate, grammatically correct, not the work of someone acting in blind rage, but someone making a calculated statement. Someone who felt wronged and wanted the community to know that this destruction was payback. But for what? Within days, theories began to multiply like bacteria in a wound. And as with most mysteries where the truth remains elusive, the theories revealed as much about the community's fears and prejudices as they did about the actual crime. The first theory to gain traction involved a Native American woman who had allegedly been assaulted by white men in Ellensburg. According to this version of events, she had sought justice from the town's authorities and been ignored or dismissed. Enraged by this betrayal, she had returned with the intent to destroy the town that had failed to protect her. The theory's proponents pointed to several supposed pieces of evidence: reports of a native woman seen in town in the days before the fire, the nature of the red card message suggesting personal grievance, the simultaneous ignition points requiring local knowledge of the town's layout. But the theory was built on prejudice more than evidence. There were no credible witnesses who could identify such a woman. No records exist of any formal complaint being filed. And the logistics of one person setting multiple simultaneous fires across 10 city blocks, while avoiding detection, stretched credulity to breaking point. What this theory really reflected was the uncomfortable racial dynamic of the American West in 1889, a time when Native Americans were routinely blamed for crimes with little evidence, when their own suffering was dismissed or ignored, when justice was a commodity available primarily to white settlers. The theory gained no official traction, but it persisted in whispers and speculation, a convenient explanation that required no real examination of the community's own failings. Another popular explanation centered on the transient population that moved through railroad towns like Ellensburg. In the late 1800s, America's rail system had created a mobile underclass of unemployed workers, drifters, and those displaced by economic hardship. These tramps, or hobos, rode the rails from town to town looking for work, often living in camps near the tracks. Railroad towns viewed this population with suspicion and, often, outright hostility. Vagrancy laws were used to harass and jail transients. They were blamed for theft, violence, and general disorder. When something bad happened and the perpetrator couldn't be identified, blaming tramps was a convenient default. The red cards seemed to support this theory. You have no pity, we show no mercy, could easily be interpreted as the words of men who'd been denied work, food, or basic human dignity by a prosperous town that wanted them to move along. Perhaps they'd been arrested, beaten, or run out of town by Ellensburg's authorities. Perhaps this was their revenge. Several citizens claimed to have seen suspicious characters in town in the days before the fire, though descriptions were vague and contradictory. No specific individuals were ever identified. No arrests were made based on this theory. What's particularly interesting about this explanation is what it reveals about class tensions in Gilded Age America. Ellensburg was a town of strivers and builders, people who'd come west to make their fortunes. The presence of men who'd failed to thrive, who existed on the margins, was both a reminder of how precarious prosperity could be and a convenient scapegoat when disaster struck. Perhaps the most cynical theory, and the one that newspapers were careful to only hint at, suggested that the fire had been set by someone within the community itself for financial gain. Fires were common in 19th century American towns, and insurance fraud through arson was equally common. Buildings were often insured for more than their actual value. A struggling business owner facing bankruptcy might find that a well-timed fire could solve all their problems, especially if the fire spread far enough that their deliberate act would be lost in general catastrophe. Newspapers in the aftermath reported cryptically about investigations on foot regarding one who was burned out, yet heavily insured. They promised that if this party was found guilty, he will be most rigidly dealt with. But no name was ever published. No arrest was ever made, and no evidence emerged to support the theory beyond speculation. The problem with this explanation is scale. Setting a fire to claim insurance on one building is one thing. Setting multiple fires that destroy an entire business district is quite another. The risk of being caught would be enormous. The moral calculation killing the town to save yourself would require a level of sociopathy that seems inconsistent with someone integrated enough in the community to own an insured business. Unless, of course, multiple business owners had conspired together. Unless the destruction was meant to benefit more than one person. Unless, but here the theory dissolves into paranoia and speculation without evidence. This is where the mystery takes its darkest and most fascinating turn. Because there's one theory that, while never proven, makes a terrible kind of sense. A theory that retired fire investigator Charles Hanson has devoted years to researching. A theory that involves not random revenge or personal greed, but cold political calculation. Remember the Constitutional Convention that began in Olympia on July 4, 1889, the same day as the Ellensburg Fire. Remember Ellensburg's ambition to become the state capital. Remember that in a competition for that kind of prize, there are winners and losers, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Hanson's theory is chilling in its simplicity. What if the fire was set by agents of another city, most likely Olympia, to eliminate Ellensburg's bid for the capital? Consider the circumstantial evidence, timing. The fire occurred on the exact day the Constitutional Convention began. The day when discussions about the capital location would be at the forefront of delegates' minds. News of Ellensburg burning would reach Olympia quickly, and the psychological impact would be enormous. How could a city that couldn't even protect itself from fire be trusted to host the state government? Method: the multiple ignition points suggest coordination and planning. This wasn't opportunistic, it was executed. Setting fires simultaneously would require either multiple perpetrators or sophisticated incendiary devices, neither consistent with a random act of revenge. Impact: the fire effectively ended Ellensburg's capital aspirations. While the town rebuilt within months, the psychological damage was done. The narrative shifted from Ellensburg, the thriving hub, to Ellensburg, the town that burned. When the final vote came, Olympia retained the capital. Ellensburg never recovered its momentum. The red cards, viewed through this lens, the message takes on new meaning. You have no pity, we show no mercy, isn't just rage, it's a taunt. It's telling Ellensburg that someone knows what the town wanted and has deliberately taken it away. But here's the problem, there's no direct evidence. No witness saw anyone from Olympia or any other rival city in Ellensburg that night. No documents exist suggesting conspiracy. No deathbed confessions ever emerged. The theory remains forever in the realm of the circumstantial and suggestive. Hansen has spent countless hours in archives, examining newspaper accounts, fire reports, insurance records, and personal correspondence from the period. He's traced the movements of various political figures. He's analyzed the pattern of fires that swept through Washington Territory, that summer Seattle in June, Ellensburg in July, Spokane in August, looking for connections. It sure seems like it was planned and executed by someone who was angry. Hansen told reporters, if that was true, it's pretty chilling. When pressed on the political angle, he's more circumspect. I'm not saying it was politically motivated, but that's what was going on at the time. The list of possible motivations goes on and on. But in private conversations, and in the pattern of his research, it's clear what Hansen believes, that the Great Ellensburg Fire was political assassination by arson. That someone, somewhere, made a cold calculation that burning Ellensburg was worth it to secure their city's future. One final theory, mentioned briefly by Hansen and others, suggested that Chinese immigrants might have been responsible. Like the Native American theory, this one was built more on xenophobia than evidence. By 1889, Chinese workers had been in the Pacific Northwest for decades, primarily building railroads and working in mines. They faced endemic racism, violent attacks, and systematic discrimination. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1880, too, had effectively stopped new Chinese immigration, and many communities actively drove out their Chinese residents through intimidation and violence. Some theorized that Chinese workers, facing persecution and denied basic rights, had struck back against Ellensburg. But again, no evidence, no witnesses, no credible motive beyond the generic, they must have been angry. What's particularly disturbing about this theory is how readily it was accepted and repeated in some circles, reflecting the casual racism of the era. It was easier for some people to believe in a vast Chinese conspiracy than to examine more uncomfortable possibilities like their own community's role in creating conditions for disaster, or the possibility that respectable white politicians might resort to terrorism. So what did the official investigation conclude? Nothing, absolutely nothing. Despite promises of rigorous inquiry, despite speculation in newspapers, despite the red cards and the theories and the obvious signs that this was arson, no one was ever arrested. No one was ever charged. No official determination of cause was ever recorded. This lack of resolution is itself suspicious. Major fires in the 19th century typically resulted in some official finding, even if it was cause unknown or accidental ignition. But the Ellensburg Fire investigation simply stopped. Newspaper coverage dwindled. Officials moved on to the pressing business of rebuilding, and the mystery was quietly filed away. Why? Perhaps because the truth was too dangerous. Perhaps because powerful people were involved. Perhaps because, in the end, Ellensburg needed to rebuild and move forward more than it needed justice. Or perhaps because, as with so many crimes where the evidence is circumstantial, and the suspects are either powerless Native Americans, Chinese, tramps, or powerful political interests. Machinery of justice simply couldn't or wouldn't function. The fire remained officially unexplained. The red cards disappeared from the historical record. No examples survive in any archive or museum collection. And Ellensburg rebuilt, brick by brick, street by street, without ever learning who had tried to destroy it. In the days and weeks following the fire, Ellensburg demonstrated the kind of resilience that was typical of American frontier communities. Within hours of the flames dying, tent cities began to spring up on the outskirts of the destroyed area. Businesses reopened under canvas, conducting commerce even before the ruins had cooled. Help poured in from across the territory and beyond. Seattle, which had burned just a month earlier, sent supplies and materials. Olympia, whatever its possible involvement, sent aid. Yakima, Spokane, Tacoma, even San Francisco contributed money, lumber, and support. This was the other face of Western expansion. Communities that competed fiercely could also band together in crisis. The Northern Pacific Railroad, recognizing that its investment in Ellensburg demanded protection, expedited shipments of building materials. Lumber, brick, and stone arrived by the trainload. Where it had taken years to build the original wooden town, the new Ellensburg rose from the ashes in months. But this new Ellensburg was different. The town that had burned had been built of wood quick, cheap, and dangerously flammable. The town that rose to replace it was built of brick and stone. Building codes were hastily implemented. Fire safety became a priority. The volunteer fire department was expanded and better equipped. Walk through downtown Ellensburg today, and you'll see the year 1889 carved into the cornerstones of numerous buildings. These aren't monuments to destruction. They're declarations of survival. Each date is a statement. We rebuilt, we endured, we refused to disappear. By November of 1889, when Washington officially became the 42nd state, Ellensburg had substantially recovered its physical infrastructure. But something intangible had been lost, something that could never be rebuilt with brick and mortar. Ellensburg never became the state capital. When the final vote was taken, Olympia retained its status. Later attempts to relocate the capital failed. The town that had been perfectly positioned, ideally located, ready to assume its role in state government, remained a regional hub, important, yes, prosperous, certainly, but not the capital, not the center of power. Was this the fire's doing? It's impossible to prove causally, but the timing and the psychology are suggestive. In the crucial months when Ellensburg needed to project strength, stability, and permanence, it instead became known as the town that burned. However quickly it rebuilt, that image persisted, and in politics, image often matters more than reality. If the fire was indeed political arson, if it was a calculated strike against Ellensburg's capital aspirations, then it succeeded completely. The town survived, but its greatest ambition died in the flames. The citizens of Ellensburg had to live with this. They had to watch as the capital remained in Olympia, had to accept that their town's future would be different than they'd imagined. Some residents left, seeking opportunities elsewhere. Others stayed and adapted, building successful businesses and lives in a town that would be regional rather than statewide in its influence. But the question haunted them, what if the fire hadn't happened? What if they'd become the capital? How would their lives, their community, their entire trajectory have been different? These are questions without answers, ghosts that can never be laid to rest. Ellensburg's fire wasn't isolated. As we've noted, Seattle burned in June, Ellensburg in July, and Spokane in August of 1880. 9. Vancouver, Washington also suffered a major fire that summer, suspected to be arson. Some historians have looked for connections between these fires. Were they all accidental, the inevitable result of wooden cities in a dry summer? Or was there a pattern? A campaign? The evidence is frustratingly ambiguous. Seattle's fire was clearly accidental. Multiple witnesses saw John Back overturn the glue pot that started it. Spokane's fire began in a restaurant and spread due to inadequate water pressure and unfortunate wind conditions. These seem to be tragedies of circumstance rather than design. But Ellensburg's fire, with its multiple ignition points and red cards, stands apart. And that difference has kept investigators and amateur detectives searching for answers more than a century later. In 2006, when fire investigator Charles Hanson began researching the Ellensburg fire, he didn't expect to become obsessed. But that's what happened. The more he learned, the more convinced he became that this was a solvable mystery, if only the right evidence could be found. Hanson's approach was methodical. He reviewed every newspaper account he could find from the period. He examined fire department records, insurance claims, and personal correspondence. He studied the layout of 1880, 9 Ellensburg, trying to understand how fires could ignite simultaneously across such a wide area. He researched the political rivalries surrounding the capital selection. What he found was a mystery that seemed to want to remain unsolved. Key documents were missing. The red cards had vanished from the historical record, no photographs, no preserved examples, just the second-hand accounts in newspapers. Witnesses had died decades ago, taking their testimony to the grave. But Hanson also found tantalizing hints. Patterns of insurance claims that seemed suspicious. Political correspondence that suggested the capital question was more contentious than official histories acknowledged. Technical details about the fires spread that supported the multiple ignition theory. It's purely fascinating to learn all the details, Hanson told reporters in 2006. Hopefully, the more I study, the closer I will get to a cause. Nearly 2 decades later, Hanson's investigation continues. He hasn't found the smoking gun, the definitive proof that would solve the mystery once and for all. But he's built a circumstantial case strong enough that serious historians now discuss his political assassination theory alongside the more conventional explanations. And perhaps that's as close as we'll ever get to the truth. One of the most frustrating aspects of the Ellensburg fire mystery is how much evidence has been lost to time. The red cards, which would be the most direct physical evidence of arson and intent, have disappeared completely. No archives, no museums, no private collections contain examples. We know they existed because multiple independent newspaper accounts mention them. But the cards themselves are gone. Why? Possibilities include destroyed in subsequent fires. Catitas County experienced other fires over the decades. Records and artifacts were lost, deliberately hidden or destroyed. If the cards implicated powerful people or uncomfortable truths, they might have been deliberately removed from the historical record. Simply discarded. In the chaos of rebuilding, items that seemed important immediately after the fire might have been discarded as worthless once the immediate crisis passed. Never collected in the first place, perhaps no one thought to preserve the cards as evidence. They were read, noted, and then destroyed or lost. The absence of the cards means we're relying on second-hand descriptions. We don't know the exact wording beyond the single quoted phrase. We don't know if all the cards were identical or if there were variations. We don't know how many cards there were or who specifically received them. These gaps leave room for doubt and speculation that physical evidence might have resolved. Similarly, detailed fire investigation reports from 1889, if they ever existed, have not survived. We have newspaper accounts, insurance records, and general descriptions, but nothing approaching the forensic detail that modern investigators would consider standard. The mystery endures partly because the evidence to solve it has been lost or hidden. For the residents of modern Ellensburg, the fire of 1889 exists in a strange temporal space. It's simultaneously ancient history and living presence. Most people know that the downtown buildings date from 1889, can point to the carved dates in cornerstones, have heard stories passed down through families. But ask about the fire itself, about who said it, about why, and you'll get shrugs, speculation, and the general acceptance that some questions don't have answers. It's one of those things. A local historian told me, we know it happened, we know it changed everything, but we've made peace with not knowing who did it. That phrase, made peace with not knowing, is interesting. It suggests a conscious decision, an accommodation with uncertainty, because the alternative is obsession, conspiracy theories, endless speculation that leads nowhere productive. But has Ellensburg truly made peace? Or is this acceptance just exhaustion, the community equivalent of scar tissue forming over a wound that never properly healed? Inevitably, a mystery this profound spawns ghost stories. Ellensburg has its share. Some residents report strange occurrences in the oldest buildings, the ones that survived the fire or were built immediately after. Unexplained cold spots, the smell of smoke when no fire is burning, the sound of crackling flames that have no source, doors that won't stay locked, windows that rattle on still nights. Are these genuine paranormal phenomena, or simply the way humans cope with historical trauma, by transforming it into stories that can be told, shared, and processed? The anthropologist in me suspects the latter, but the part of me that's spent too many nights researching dark history isn't entirely sure. One story in particular persists, that on the night of July the 4th, if you walk through downtown Ellensburg after midnight, you can sometimes see orange light flickering in windows of buildings that are dark and empty, not consistently, not reliably, but sometimes. And those who see it report feeling a deep, inexplicable dread, the kind of fear that comes not from what you see, but from what it represents. A local bar owner told me he'd experienced it once. I was closing up late, around 2 in the morning, looked down Main Street and saw what I thought was a fire in the old brick building near 4th Avenue, called 911, ran toward it with a fire extinguisher, but when I got there, nothing. Building was dark, locked up, cold to the touch. Fire trucks came, checked everything out. No signs of fire, no explanation for what I'd seen. The dispatcher told me I wasn't the first person to call in a fire that wasn't there on that date. Ghost story, mass delusion, or something else, perhaps the way trauma imprints itself on a place, echoing forward through time. Walk through Ellensburg today, and you'll find a thriving college town of about 1,000 residents. Central Washington University dominates the economy and culture. The historic downtown, built from the ashes of 1889, has been carefully preserved and is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. The town is proud of its Victorian-era architecture, proud of how its ancestors rebuilt. Tourism marketing emphasizes the historic buildings, the Western heritage, the resilience of the community. But the fire itself, the mystery, the red cards, the political theories, these receive less attention. They're not secrets exactly, but they're not highlighted either. Perhaps because unsolved mysteries don't fit neatly into narratives of triumph and recovery. Perhaps because reopening questions about who destroyed the town and why might force uncomfortable examinations of power, politics, and the price of ambition. Charles Hanson's research has sparked renewed interest, particularly among true crime enthusiasts and amateur historians who have found his work online. But this interest exists largely outside Ellensburg itself. The community that lived through the trauma and rebuilt from it seems less interested in revisiting those questions than outsiders who approach it as an intellectual puzzle. This is understandable. For Ellensburg residents, the fire isn't a mystery to be solved. It's a scar in their town's history, a wound that healed but left a mark. Opening it up, probing it, demanding answers. What purpose would that serve? The perpetrators are long dead. Justice, if it was ever possible, is now impossible, and Ellensburg has moved on. Or has it? 135 years after the fact, can justice even be meaningful? If we definitively prove tomorrow that the fire was set by political operatives from Olympia, what would that change? The perpetrators are dead, their children are dead, their grandchildren are probably dead. The political structures they served have been replaced multiple times over. The state capital is firmly established, and no one's attempting to relocate it. The Ellensburg that burned doesn't exist anymore, replaced by a completely different town that just happens to occupy the same physical space. So why does the mystery still matter? Perhaps because justice isn't just about punishment. It's also about truth, about ensuring that what happened is acknowledged and understood, about refusing to let crimes be forgotten simply because time has passed. If the Ellensburg fire was indeed political terrorism, if a town's future was deliberately destroyed for another city's gain, that's a story that says something profound about democracy, about civilization, about the lengths people will go to for power. And if we allow that story to remain hidden, if we accept, we'll never know. As the final answer, we're complicit in burying a truth that might contain important lessons. Or perhaps I'm overthinking it. Perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. Perhaps the uncertainty itself is the point, the lesson that human history is full of unknowable moments, and learning to live with ambiguity is part of wisdom. Let's return to those red cards one final time. You have no pity. We show no mercy. Assume for a moment they were real. Assume the newspaper accounts were accurate. What do those words tell us about the mind that wrote them? You have no pity. This is an accusation. The writer is claiming that Ellensburg, or specific people in Ellensburg, showed cruelty, hardness, lack of compassion. They denied something: work, justice, mercy, opportunity. They excluded someone, hurt someone, ignored someone's suffering. We show no mercy. This is both threat and action. The use of we suggests either multiple perpetrators or someone speaking for a group. The future tense show becomes present tense in the act of the fire itself. This is mercy being withheld in real time. The parallelism with you have no pity creates equivalence. You did this to us, so we do this to you. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth, fire for what? The message is sophisticated enough to suggest education, planning, deliberation. This wasn't scrawled in rage. It was carefully composed to communicate a specific idea, and what it communicates is a kind of terrible, rational madness. We are giving you what you gave us. But who was we? Who was you? What was the original sin that justified this punishment? Without the cards themselves, without knowing who received them, without understanding the context that would make the message clear, we're left with fragments of a conversation we weren't part of. trying to reconstruct an argument from one bitter sentence. One of the most striking aspects of the Ellensburg Fire is how little the survivors said about it in later years. In an era when memoirs and oral histories were common, when people documented their frontier experiences extensively, the voices of those who lived through Ellensburg's burning night are remarkably absent. A few newspaper interviews, brief mentions in historical society records, but no extensive personal accounts, no detailed memoirs, no collections of letters describing what it was like. Why the silence? Trauma. Perhaps the experience was too painful to revisit. Watching your town burn, losing everything, facing an uncertain future. These aren't memories people want to dwell on. Complicity. Perhaps some survivors knew more than they ever admitted. Perhaps they knew who set the fire or why, and chose silence to protect themselves or others. Futility. Perhaps they tried to speak and were ignored. Perhaps they realized early on that without evidence, their theories and suspicions would remain just that, unprovable allegations that would divide the community without bringing resolution. Cultural norms. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, there was a strong cultural emphasis on moving forward, not dwelling on misfortune. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps wasn't just a metaphor, it was an expectation. Talking extensively about disasters, losses, and suffering might have been seen as weakness or self-pity. Whatever the reason, the silence means we've lost the voices that could tell us what really happened. The witnesses are gone, and they took their testimony with them. What happens when an entire town burns and no one ever learns why? What happens when the question of responsibility remains forever open, when justice is forever deferred, when the only certainty is uncertainty? You live with ghosts. Not the supernatural kind, though those stories emerge too, but the ghosts of unanswered questions, of truth that slipped away, of a moment when your community was violated and the violation was never acknowledged or avenged. The Ellensburg Fire of 1889 has haunted me throughout this investigation in ways I didn't expect. Perhaps it's because the mystery is so perfectly balanced, enough evidence to suggest arson, not enough to prove it. Enough theories to fill books, none conclusive. Enough hints at political conspiracy to be compelling, never enough to be convincing. Or perhaps it's because the fire represents something deeper than one town's tragedy. It represents the fragility of civilization itself. Ellensburg in 1889 was a thriving, modern, ambitious community. It had everything: railroad connections, bustling commerce, civic infrastructure, dreams of greatness. And in a single night, it was reduced to ash and ruin. How quickly prosperity becomes dust. How thin the line between order and chaos. How vulnerable we all are to forces, whether natural disaster or human malice, that can erase in hours what took years to build. But there's another lesson here, equally important: resilience. Ellensburg burned, yes, but Ellensburg rebuilt. Within months, the town was functioning again. Within a few years, it was thriving. The fire changed the trajectory, ended the dream of becoming the state capital, left scars that never fully healed. But it didn't end the town, couldn't end the town, because the town was never just buildings. It was people, and people are harder to destroy than lumber and brick. Today, Ellensburg stands as a testament to both human vulnerability and human resilience. The 1889 dates carved into downtown cornerstones are memorials and declarations. This is when we fell, and this is when we rose again. It's July the 4th again, not 1889, but now, today, more than 13 decades later. The sun sets over the Cascade Mountains, painting the sky in orange and red. colors that might remind you of fire if you were thinking about fire. Downtown Ellensburg is busy with celebrations. Families walk the historic streets, pointing at the Victorian-era buildings, admiring the architecture. Children run between adults' legs, too excited by the holiday to sit still. Later, when full darkness falls, there will be fireworks carefully controlled, heavily regulated, nothing like the explosive chaos of that night so long ago. But pause for a moment. Look at those brick facades, those stone foundations, those dates carved into cornerstones. Remember what stood here before: wooden buildings full of dreams and ambition and people who believed they were building something permanent, something that would last. Remember that one night someone destroyed it all, someone with a message written on red cards that have vanished like smoke, someone who believed Ellensburg deserved to burn. And remember that we still don't know who. That the fire of 1889, the fire that started everywhere at once, the fire that ended a town's greatest ambition, the fire that changed everything, remains unsolved. A mystery wrapped in ashes, haunting every brick street and stone building, waiting for someone to finally uncover what really happened on Independence Day, 1889. The red cards are gone, the perpetrators are dust, the witnesses are silent, but the question remains, burning still: who destroyed Ellensburg, and why? If this journey through flame and mystery has resonated with you, if you find yourself wondering about those red cards and what truth they carried, if the question of who burned Ellensburg keeps you awake tonight, then you understand what it means to live with history's unanswered questions. This channel exists because some stories refuse to stay buried, because the past has teeth and memory, and sometimes it demands to be heard even when all the voices are gone. If you're willing to confront the uncomfortable truths about human nature, the capacity for destruction, the price of ambition, the crimes that go unpunished, then subscribe to the Untold Hour. We have more mysteries waiting in the shadows, more questions that history tried to erase, more truths that demand to be spoken. Leave a like if this story of fire and conspiracy, of destroyed dreams and resilient communities, moved you to something deeper than entertainment. If it made you think about how quickly everything can burn, how fragile our civilizations really are, and how often justice goes unserved. And in the comments, I want to know, if you could ask one question and receive a definitive answer about the Ellensburg fire, one question that would be answered with absolute certainty, what would you ask? Who set the fires? Were the red cards real? Was it political assassination? And perhaps more importantly, do you believe we have a responsibility to solve old crimes, even when everyone involved is long dead? Or do some mysteries deserve to stay buried? Until next time, remember, the most terrifying fires are the ones we never saw coming. And sometimes the darkest smoke comes not from what burned, but from the truths that were hidden in the flames. The past is never dead. It's not even past. It's just waiting for someone brave enough to walk through the ashes and demand answers.